At a crowded airport, an Army colonel carries out a mission not the hardest, but the most sacred, bringing a fallen comrade home to his family. But he is suddenly stopped at the check-in gate without a clear. The airline's decisions not only made him but also most of the people around him feel indignant. What the airline fails to realize is that they are not just stopping one soldier, they are about to face the full weight of the U.S. military and the power of a nation that refuses to look away. The airport was alive with movement, the usual controlled chaos of families juggling luggage, business travelers typing away on their phones, the occasional child darting ahead of exhausted parents. Overhead, the crisp voice of an announcer echoed flight departures and boarding calls, blending into the rhythmic hum of the terminal. Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, a place that had seen millions of passengers, but today, one stood out among the rest. Colonel Nathaniel Briggs walked through the automatic doors, his presence commanding in the way only a military man's could be. His uniform was pristine, his black boots polished to a mirror shine. The glint of silver and bronze on his chest, medals earned through sweat, sacrifice, and unwavering duty, told the story of a man who had given his life to his country. His deep brown skin, lined slightly at the corners of his sharp eyes, carried the weight of years spent leading men into battles, making impossible choices, ensuring that no soldier was left behind. But today, there was one he couldn't bring back alive. Briggs adjusted his grip on the folder in his hand. Official military orders, the name Aaron Hughes printed clearly across the top. 22 years old. Gone too soon. The weight of the mission pressed against his chest, heavier than the medals, heavier than anything else he had carried in his years of service. This wasn't just a flight. This was a promise. Aaron's mother had called him the night before. Her voice was calm, but he could hear the strain underneath, the effort it took to hold back tears. "Please bring my boy home, Colonel." Briggs had assured her he would. He had done this before. He knew the drill. Escort the body, ensure safe transport, stay with the remains until they were handed over to the family with full military honors. It wasn't the hardest mission he had ever undertaken, but it was the most sacred. The line at the airline check-in counter moved at an agonizing pace, passengers shifting impatiently, adjusting luggage, murmuring to one another. Briggs stepped forward, placing his documents on the counter with the efficiency of a man who had done this more times than he cared to count. The young man behind the desk, Zachary Holt, barely glanced at him before tapping at his keyboard. "ID?" Holt asked, voice clipped, uninterested. Briggs handed it over without a word, watching as the man's eyes darted across the screen. There was a pause. A moment of hesitation too long to be routine. Holt's fingers hovered over the keyboard before he pursed his lips and frowned. Just a second," he muttered, looking over his shoulder toward his supervisor. A blonde woman in a neatly pressed navy blue blazer, standing a few feet away. There was something in his body language, a stiffness, a shift, like a man who just realized he'd stepped into something he wasn't prepared for. Briggs remained still, his patience worn down from years of waiting in far worse conditions than an airport line. He had been shot at in deserts, negotiated in war zones, stood unwavering before men who had tried to break him. But there was something in the air now, something he had felt before, in different settings, under different names, but always the same in the end. Holt cleared his throat, straightening his posture like a man bracing himself for backlash. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside for a moment. There's an issue with your ticket." Briggs didn't move, didn't blink. His tone remained even. "What issue?" The agent's smile was tight, artificial. It's a verification thing. You weren't flagged for pre-clearance, so we can't confirm military transport status." Briggs exhaled slowly, controlled. He tapped the folder on the counter with deliberate precision. "That's my military order. It's signed by the Department of Defense. I've done this before, and I know the procedure. There's no reason I should be denied boarding." Holt's eyes flickered up, but not to meet Briggs's. Instead, they darted toward his supervisor, who was now watching closely. A hint of something unreadable in her expression. A quiet exchange passed between them, a glance, a slight shift of the shoulders. Then, as if deciding something, she nodded. Holt turned back, this time looking Briggs dead in the eye, and said, "I'm sorry, sir, but we can't verify your credentials. You won't be able to board this flight." The words landed with a weight Briggs had felt before. not in the military, where his rank had always been respected, but outside of it. In stores, in meetings, in spaces where his uniform didn't shield him from assumptions, where his skin spoke before he did. He let the moment stretch, let the silence settle around them like the calm before a storm. Then, with slow, deliberate precision, he picked up his ID and orders, slid them back into the folder, and placed both hands on the counter. His voice was steady. "Is there a specific reason my credentials suddenly need extra verification?" Holt's jaw tensed. "It's standard protocol, sir." Briggs tilted his head slightly. "I see. And how many other military officers have had their orders questioned today?" Behind him, the murmur of passengers quieted. A few people in line shifted, sensing the tension. Someone muttered under their breath. The weight of watching eyes settled onto the interaction, making the moment heavier. Holt hesitated. Then, in a voice just a little too careful, he said, "We've had incidents before. People claiming military status to get priority boarding or upgrades. You understand." There it was. Not said outright. Not blunt or obvious. But there, buried just enough beneath bureaucratic wording and polite phrasing to give plausible deniability. Briggs had faced worse. Had swallowed worse. But not today. Not for this. He straightened, squaring his shoulders. He wasn't moving. The line behind him had gone still. The quiet murmurs of conversation had faded, replaced by the distinct weight of awareness. A man in a dark green polo shirt frowned, shifting his luggage. A woman in a red coat glanced at her husband, brows knitting together. And then, a voice low, gravelly, edged with decades of experience and something dangerously close to anger. "You got an issue with his clearance, son." Briggs turned his head slightly. Richard Tate, mid-60s, weathered skin, a USMC hat pulled low over his brow, a Marine. Tate stepped forward, his posture straight despite his age, and looked Holt dead in the eye. "'Cause I've been through TSA more times than I can count, and I ain't never seen protocol deny a soldier from bringing a fallen brother home." The energy in the room shifted, subtle but powerful. More passengers were watching now, some pulling out their phones. Holt glanced around, realizing too late that the situation was slipping beyond his control. The weight of public scrutiny was pressing down, and Briggs could see it in his eyes. The supervisor took a step forward, clearing her throat. "Sir, we—" But before she could finish, a sharp, deliberate click rang out. Someone had started recording. And just like that, the moment was no longer just between them. It was bigger. Larger than Holt. Larger than Briggs. Larger than a denied flight. It was a story, and stories had power. Holt's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard, eyes darting between the supervisor and the passengers now gathering behind Briggs. The weight of the moment pressed against his chest, and he hesitated just long enough for Briggs to see the flicker of uncertainty in his face. This wasn't going the way he expected. This wasn't supposed to be a scene. The supervisor, standing just behind the counter, arms crossed, jaw set, stepped in before the moment could unravel further. "Sir," she said, her voice measured but laced with an edge of forced patience, the kind used on people you don't expect to listen. "As I said, this is standard protocol. If you'd like, you can step aside while we verify your documentation, but I'm afraid we can't allow you to board at this time." The words landed with a deliberate finality, the kind that dared him to argue, dared him to push back so she could call security and turn this into something else. Briggs recognized the game he had seen it in boardrooms, in checkpoints, in meetings where his rank was supposed to speak for itself but somehow never quite did. It wasn't about the ticket. It was about control, about making him back down. But he wasn't backing down. Briggs exhaled slowly, adjusting his stance, centering himself in the way years of military discipline had taught him. He tapped the folder against the counter, slow and deliberate. "I don't need verification. I have my military orders. I have my ID. I know the process. What I don't have," he said, voice steady, "is time for whatever game you're playing." A hush settled over the surrounding crowd. Passengers were no longer just watching, they were waiting. Waiting to see what would happen next. Waiting to see how far this would go. Richard Tate let out a breath through his nose, stepping closer to the counter, his Marine cap casting a shadow over his lined face. "Son," he said, his voice steady but firm, the weight of decades in his tone. "I'd think real hard before you dig this hole any deeper." Holt flinched at the words, but it was the supervisor who stiffened. Something flickered in her eyes, a challenge, a quiet refusal to let this slip away without a fight. Briggs knew her type. He had sat across from them in strategy briefings, the ones who played by the rules only when it suited them. She wasn't looking for a solution. She was looking for a way to win. "I'm sorry you feel this is unfair," she said, her voice carefully neutral, "but I assure you, it has nothing to do with anything but protocol." Briggs let the words settle between them, let them breathe, let them stretch out into the space where both of them knew she was lying. Then, with the slow precision of a man who had spent years in high-stakes negotiations where lives were on the line, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. "If it's just protocol," he said, unlocking the screen with a practiced swipe, "then I'm sure my CO will be happy to clear this up." The supervisor's jaw clenched. Briggs pressed dial. The phone rang twice before a crisp voice answered. General Dillard. Briggs didn't bother with pleasantries. "Sir, I'm standing at the American Airways counter at Defu, being told I can't board my assigned flight while escorting Private Hughes home. The airline is claiming there's an issue with my military clearance, despite my orders being fully in line with protocol." There was silence on the other end. Not the kind of silence that meant confusion, the kind that meant calculation. The kind that meant Dillard had just realized something he didn't like. Briggs could almost hear the tightening of the general's jaw before he spoke. "Put me on speaker." Briggs did. "Who am I speaking to?" Dillard's voice carried through the phone like a bullet through glass, sharp, unwavering, unmistakably authoritative. The supervisor hesitated, her lips parting slightly, as if considering her options. Then, with a stiff inhale, she straightened her blazer and spoke. "Rebecca Langston, Senior Operations Manager for American Airways." "Well, Ms. Langston," Dillard said, his tone cutting through the air like a cold wind, "you are currently obstructing a United States Army colonel from carrying out an authorized military escort. Now, I'm sure this is all just a misunderstanding, so why don't you explain to me exactly why he's being denied?" Langston hesitated, her fingers pressing into the counter, the weight of the room suddenly shifting against her. Holt's breathing had gone shallow. Briggs didn't move. Passengers around them leaned in slightly, phones still recording, eyes locked on the unfolding moment like spectators at an execution. Langston swallowed. "As I stated earlier, General, this is a routine security protocol. It's—" "No, it's not." Dillard's interruption was smooth, absolute. "Because if it were, we wouldn't be having this conversation." Langston blinked. Dillard continued. "Colonel Briggs is escorting the remains of a fallen soldier. That's not a request. That's not a privilege. That's a duty. And unless you want your name attached to an official complaint to both the Department of Defense and the Department of Transportation, I suggest you correct this mistake. Immediately." The final word hit the air like a gunshot. Langston didn't move, her eyes flicking to Holt, then back to the growing crowd, the cameras still rolling. She wasn't just up against Briggs anymore. She was up against the military. Up against public scrutiny. Briggs could see the moment she realized she had lost. She licked her lips, exhaled sharply through her nose, then nodded once. "Let me check something," she muttered before turning sharply on her heel and disappearing behind a frosted glass door marked "Employees Only." A murmur spread through the terminal as people exchanged looks, glancing between Briggs and the counter, whispers growing like a rising tide. A woman in a navy blue sweater shook her head. A man in a business suit muttered, "Unbelievable." Briggs remained still, his expression unreadable, his posture unshaken. Tate exhaled through his nose, arms crossed. "That's what I thought." Holt's hands were clenched into fists, his eyes darting toward the back room like he wanted to follow Langston, but knew it wouldn't do him any good. Briggs lowered his phone from speaker mode. Dillard was still on the line. "If she tries anything," the general said, his voice a shade lower now, "you call me again. Understood?" Briggs nodded slightly. "Understood, sir." The line went dead. And now they waited. The minutes dragged. The tension in the air had settled into something dense, something immovable. The murmurs in the terminal had quieted, but the weight of 100 unseen eyes pressed against Briggs's back. He didn't turn. He didn't shift. He stood as he always had, solid, unyielding, a soldier in the face of bureaucracy disguised as order. The glass door Langston had disappeared behind remained shut, the frosted pane obscuring whatever conversation was happening on the other side. Holt, still behind the counter, had gone stiff, his fingers twitching against the keyboard, but he wasn't typing. He was waiting, just like everyone else. A sharp, clipped voice carried from behind Briggs, rough with age but clear with intent. Richard Tate, arms crossed, voice edged with a quiet fury. "She's stalling." Briggs didn't answer. He didn't need to. The man in the business suit behind him shifted, clearing his throat, his grip tightening around the handle of his carry-on. A woman in a beige coat, standing near the boarding queue, shook her head, her lips pressing into a thin line. A younger man, maybe in his 20s, adjusted his phone, the lens angled directly at the counter. It wasn't just a situation anymore. It was a moment. A moment where silence spoke louder than anything else. Then the door clicked open. Langston stepped out, her expression carefully composed, her blazer smoothed down with an efficiency that was almost mechanical. Her heels clicked against the tile as she walked, her gaze locking onto Briggs with a look that wasn't quite surrender, but something close. She stopped at the counter. Holt straightened instinctively, his fingers finally typing again, though slower this time, like a man trying to look busy. Langston inhaled sharply through her nose, exhaled through her mouth, then lifted her chin. "Colonel Briggs," she started, her voice measured, professional, controlled. "I appreciate your patience while we conducted a thorough review of your documentation." Briggs said nothing. Langston glanced at the growing crowd, then back to him. The pause stretched. She licked her lips. "We have decided to proceed with verifying your military escort status through the appropriate channels. Unfortunately, this process takes time. We are unable to accommodate you on this flight." The air in the terminal shifted. Someone exhaled sharply. A voice in the crowd, somewhere behind Briggs, a sharp, incredulous "what?" Briggs felt the familiar thrum of something coiled, something cold and steady and honed over years of being tested in ways that had nothing to do with war zones. He exhaled, slow and controlled. "You spoke with General Dillard." Langston's jaw tightened just slightly, a small crack in the carefully curated professionalism. "Yes." "And?" She hesitated. "And as I stated, the verification process takes time." A beat. Then Tate stepped forward, voice carrying the weight of a man who had long since run out of patience. "Cut the bullshit." Langston's eyes flicked toward him, but the ex-Marine didn't flinch, didn't back down, didn't blink. His jaw clenched. "He's got orders. He's got clearance. You talked to his damn commanding officer, and you're telling me you still need time." He let out a short, humorless laugh. "Lady, I might be old, but I ain't stupid." Langston stiffened. Briggs watched her carefully, saw the way her fingers curled just slightly against the counter, the way her throat bobbed with a swallow she hadn't meant to make so visible. She wasn't backing down, but she was cornered. And then, from somewhere to the left of the counter, a new voice. Firm. Measured. Loud enough to carry. "This is wrong." Langston's eyes flicked in the direction of the speaker. It was the man in the suit. He hadn't moved much since this started, his posture stiff, arms crossed. But now his voice was deliberate, pointed, not just a passive comment but a statement meant to be heard. Another voice from behind Briggs. "Yeah, it is." Then another. A woman, the one in the beige coat, he's in uniform. A younger man, the one holding his phone up, voice edged with disbelief. "And they still won't let him board." A shift, a rumble of agreement. Langston's eyes scanned the room, suddenly aware of just how many people were watching, just how many phones were recording, just how many witnesses now existed in this space. Holt shifted beside her, looking paler than before. Briggs didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply held Langston's gaze and let her feel the gravity of what she had done. Then, slowly, deliberately, he reached for his phone again. Langston's fingers curled tighter against the counter. Briggs dialed. The call connected on the first ring. "Colonel." It was Dillard. Briggs didn't bother with introductions. His voice was steel. "She's still denying me boarding." Silence. Then, the clipped, sharp edge of a man who had just run out of patience. "Put me on speaker." Briggs did. Dillard's voice came through clear, unwavering, and loud enough for the entire damn terminal to hear. "This is Major General Marcus Dillard, United States Army." Langston's face drained of color. "I am formally instructing American Airways to immediately allow Colonel Nathaniel Briggs to board his assigned flight. He is carrying out an official military escort, and any further obstruction will result in a full federal inquiry into the handling of service members by this airline. If you have an issue, Ms. Langston, I suggest you take it up with the Department of Defense." Silence. Briggs didn't look away from Langston. She didn't look away from him. Her jaw clenched. Her fingers twitched. And then, finally, reluctantly, inevitably, she blinked, exhaled through her nose, and turned to Holt. "Print his damn boarding pass." The terminal erupted. The sound of the boarding pass printing was sharp, mechanical, final. Holt's hands trembled slightly as he tore the slip from the machine, the stiff paper crinkling between his fingers. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, then extended it toward Briggs without looking him in the eye. The colonel didn't move. The weight of the moment hadn't settled yet, hadn't fully reached where it needed to go. The terminal was still. Langston's face was taut, her composure cracking in the subtle way of a person realizing they had just lost more than a battle they had lost control. Briggs let the silence stretch. Then, slow, deliberate, he reached out and took the pass, his fingers grazing the edge of Holt's grip just enough to make the man flinch. The colonel tucked it neatly into the folder with his orders, smoothing it down with the practiced precision of a man who never left things undone. Then, finally, he spoke. That wasn't protocol, his voice calm, measured, but edged with something cold, something absolute. That was a choice. Langston inhaled sharply, but she didn't deny it. She couldn't. Holt stepped back, swallowing hard, his gaze darting anywhere but at Briggs. The air in the terminal had shifted, the power in the room redistributed in a way that was irreversible. People had seen. People had recorded. People would remember. Briggs turned slightly, scanning the faces in the crowd. The woman in the beige coat still clutched her phone, her lips pressed tight. The man in the suit stood rigid, arms crossed, eyes narrowed in quiet disapproval. Richard Tate hadn't moved, his arms still folded across his chest, but his mouth curved just slightly in something that wasn't quite a smile, more like satisfaction. Langston straightened, adjusting the lapels of her blazer like she could smooth out the moment the same way. "We were following standard security." "No," Briggs interrupted, his voice cutting through the last remnants of her authority like a scalpel through flesh. "You were following something else." Langston stiffened. For a second it looked like she might argue, might grasp at the last threads of whatever power she had left in this exchange. But the quiet around them was too thick, the eyes on her too many. Instead, she exhaled through her nose and gave a curt nod. "You're free to board." It was meant to be the end, a closing statement, a dismissal wrapped in a concession, but Briggs didn't move. He held her gaze steady, unyielding, making sure she felt the full weight of what had just transpired, the full weight of how close she had come to getting away with it. Then, finally, he inclined his head just slightly. Not a thank you, not even an acknowledgement, just a shift. Then he turned, his boots clicking against the polished floor as he moved toward the gate, the crowd parting around him like a tide making way for something too solid, too permanent to be swept away. People murmured as he passed. Some nodded. Some whispered. Some still clutched their phones, their screens illuminated with footage that was already spreading, already moving beyond the walls of the terminal, beyond the city, beyond the control of anyone who had tried to keep it quiet. He heard Richard Tate fall into step beside him. "Damn shame it had to go that far," the older man muttered, his voice gruff but edged with something close to pride. Briggs didn't respond right away. He kept walking, the boarding pass cool between his fingers, the terminal stretching ahead of him. Then, just as they neared the gate, he exhaled, slow and even. "Not the first time," he said. "Probably not the last." Tate grunted. "Maybe. But today, You made sure they won't forget it." Briggs didn't answer. He didn't need to. Because as he stepped onto that plane, he wasn't just boarding a flight. He was walking into something bigger. Briggs stepped onto the jet bridge, the hum of the plane's engines vibrating through the floor beneath his boots. The air was cool, filtered, different from the thick tension he had just walked through. As he moved forward, he felt the eyes of the passengers already seated, some craning their necks, others pretending not to stare. The flight attendants at the entrance stood a little straighter, their smiles polite but hesitant, like they weren't sure if they should acknowledge what had just unfolded outside. They had seen things, heard things, but none of them said a word. He made his way down the narrow aisle, his fingers flexing slightly at his sides, the tension not quite settled in his shoulders yet. He passed rows of weary travelers, their gazes flickering between their screens and him, some offering small nods, others choosing silence. And then, as he reached his seat, an older man near the front, dressed in a crisp business suit, turned slightly, his voice low but deliberate. "Glad you're here, Colonel." Briggs didn't pause, didn't acknowledge it beyond the slight incline of his chin. He sat, resting his folder against his lap, his boarding pass tucked neatly inside. He exhaled, slow and steady, his pulse still heavier than he liked, his mind still replaying the last 40 minutes. It wasn't victory. It was a reminder. The plane door sealed shut. The overhead chime signaled departure, and as the aircraft pushed back from the gate, Briggs finally let himself close his eyes, just for a moment. But the fight wasn't over. 35,000 feet in the air, across the country, a war had already started, not with bullets, not with battlefields, but with headlines. The video, shaky but clear, had been uploaded within minutes. U.S. Army Colonel denied flight while escorting fallen soldier. The comments flooded in. The outrage spread. And as American Airways Puerto Rico team scrambled to draft a response, a different battlefront was being prepared. A formal inquiry had been filed with the Department of Defense. Calls were already being made. And back in Washington, Major General Marcus Dillard stood in his office, his phone buzzing with notifications, his jaw set as he watched the footage play on repeat. His own voice echoed back at him through the recording, stern, unwavering, undeniable. This wasn't going away. He turned, pressing a button on his desk phone. "Get me Major Carter from JOG," he said, his voice clipped, precise. "Tell her we're moving forward with the investigation." A pause. Then, "Yes, sir." By the time Briggs stepped off the plane, the sun had already dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the tarmac. The air was different here, quieter, heavier. He could feel it before he even saw them. A small group stood just beyond the security checkpoint, waiting. A woman, her hands clutched tightly together, her shoulders squared despite the grief written into the lines of her face. Beside her, an older man, his grip firm around a folded American flag, his knuckles white with the weight of what it meant. Aaron Hughes's parents. Briggs walked toward them, his steps measured, deliberate. He didn't hesitate. Didn't falter. He had done this before, but it never got easier. Mrs. Hughes looked up as he approached, her breath catching slightly, her eyes searching his face for something, assurance, understanding, maybe just someone to share the weight of the moment. Briggs stopped in front of her, removing his cap, holding it at his side. He met her gaze, steady, unshaken. And then, in the only words that ever mattered in moments like this, he said, "Mom, I brought your son home." Her lips trembled. Her breath hitched, and for a moment the world around them stood still. Mr. Hughes swallowed hard, his eyes damp but fierce with something deeper than sorrow. He nodded once, his fingers tightening around the flag. "Thank you, Colonel." Briggs nodded back, his throat tight. He had said all he needed to say. And as he stood there, beneath the dimming sky, the weight in his chest shifted, not gone, not lighter, but carried. Because some things weren't meant to be put down. They were meant to be born. Together. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.